Joining us as he does each and every week to talk about the latest news in the state and local economy, as well as the national economy and markets, is Dr. Michael Greiner, assistant professor of management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Michael, thanks for being with us.
It's great to be back, Tyler. Happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday to you as well. And we'll start off with a topic you're pretty familiar with as a former bankruptcy attorney yourself. The state of Michigan is looking to change the way that they govern payday lending here in the state of Michigan. So for context, payday lending is often a step that people will go to when they're having trouble paying back some of their loans. They need quick cash, and so they get that cash, they pay off their loans, but now they are essentially indebted to a payday lending agency. That can snowball over time, and eventually they'll end up in bankruptcy anyway. So let's start off with just how the payday lending industry makes an impact in Michigan, and then talk about the ways that the government is looking to potentially change that relationship.
Yeah, this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, having helped people who are stuck in this trap, really. And that's what it is. Because what happens is that the people will go and borrow money at these, I'm sure people have seen them before, at these different storefronts where they advertise you can borrow up to $600 immediately. And it's not by accident that they picked that number $600. I mean, $600 is essentially the maximum that's allowed under the law. And you have to remember, Michigan has an anti-usury law, which means that banks can only charge a certain amount of interest on the different loans that they offer. But an exception was carved into that back in 2005 or so, which allowed these different payday lenders to offer loans up to $600 with virtually unlimited interest. And I remember when I was practicing bankruptcy law, I used to look at these truth and lender sheets that some of you may have seen when you bought houses, for example. And the truth and lending sheets will tell you exactly how much you're actually going to pay over the lifetime of a loan in interest. And it was absurd, the amount of interest that these people were paying when you kind of shifted their different fees and charges and special interest. And the fact also that they were charging this interest over a very compressed period. Because you have to remember, the way these payday lenders work is that they say you can borrow up to $600, but you need to pay it back in 2 weeks. And on top of that, then they'll put different fees and interest and that type of thing. And it adds up. And I've seen truth and lending disclosures that said that the interest was 1,300% or more for some of these loans, which is absurd. And what ends up happening as a result of that is these people get stuck in this cycle where they're desperate. They end up borrowing some money with a payday lender. And then to pay off the payday loan, they have to take another payday loan. And it's been found actually in research that most of these payday loans basically create this cycle where people will end up borrowing one payday loan after another, after another, after another. And the sad truth of it is that this is something that really targets the most vulnerable and the poorest in our state. And it's a way basically to suck money out of people who really can least afford it, because people become desperate. They have to pay bills, things like rent or electric bills or water bills or things like that are necessities. And they find that, they need a little bit extra to make it through to the next week. They go to one of these payday lenders, and before they know it, they're stuck taking out a new loan every 2 weeks, paying absurd amounts of interest. So it really bothers me that this is such an issue here in Michigan. And frankly, I'm very pleased to see that the legislature is finally taking notice of it. So I guess we'll talk about that here in a sec.
Yeah, so what are those steps that the legislature is considering taking in this dynamic? Because as you said, these payday loans can be useful for people, but they're also quite predatory because of the interest rates that are on them and the financial situation that consumers are in. So what could the state do to potentially mitigate that relationship, that dynamic?
Well, I'll tell you what the state could easily do, which is to outlaw the payday lenders. I mean, as I say, it's a relatively new thing that we have in Michigan, dating back only to about 2005, 2006 or so. Ironically, about the time I started practicing bankruptcy law. So as a result of that, this would be an easy change by the state. The problem is, like so many things, is once you have allowed this to happen, you've developed a constituency for it. So there's essentially a lobby out there of payday lenders who are essentially trying to protect their interests while also even trying to expand it. I mean, there's been legislation out there, for example, that has talked about increasing the amounts that payday lenders could lend up to $2,500 rather than just $600, which you could imagine the kind of hole that that would put some people into over time. And the irony is with some of these payday lenders, they don't care if people file bankruptcy, because by the time they get to the point of filing bankruptcy, they've already sucked so much money out of these people. They've made more than their investment back on them, plus a hefty profit. So as a result of that, it would be an easy step by the legislature to do something. Again, because of the fact, though, that there is this constituency that's developed for payday lending, the steps that right now are being contemplated, frankly, are pretty modest. They're talking about trying to do research. And that's not to diminish the importance of research. I mean, that's what I do for a living, so I certainly am sympathetic with it. But essentially, what they're trying to do is do research where they'll be able to quantify exactly what these payday loans do to the state. How much money does it take out of communities? To what extent does it target not just poor communities, but also minority communities? Because there's been some research that's shown that it has a higher impact, for example, on Black communities than it does, say, on white communities. And to what extent is this something then that damages the ability of these people to be able to kind of get themselves out of the cycle of dependency? I think that there's something to be said for doing the research and getting more data then that we're able to at least make informed decisions about this. But frankly, I hope that the legislature at some point will take a little bit more dramatic action on this, because I say this is something I saw close up, and it's really kind of disturbing when you see how people are being taken advantage of.
Given your expertise, Michael, in the bankruptcy law area, but and also on the predatory nature of these payday lenders, and being familiar with the amount of work that goes into research to be able to do this properly at the statewide level, and the legislature to be able to take action. If they take more modest action on this, and rather than eliminating payday lending altogether, will that even make a significant impact on consumers that would be potentially at risk of some of these predatory practices?
Well, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I think that in the short run, the answer is no. In the long run, though, it could make a difference, because the hope is that this could eventually at least open the eyes. I mean, it could be that, and I'm well aware of this situation being a researcher, that because of the fact that I've been exposed to certain specific situations, that my perception of these things grows out of control with respect to what the reality is. Again, I represented people who were debtors a lot of the time, and these people found themselves in financial trouble. And so when I saw these situations that were created as a result of the payday lending, I was horrified by it. But again, this is a very narrow group. So does it turn out based upon the research that really my concerns are overblown? That's possible. I mean, I've seen lots of cases where, for example, we've done some research on, say, the relationship between government and business. And in certain cases, it indicates that there is actually some benefit to businesses engaging in that. In other cases, there's not some benefit to businesses. And being able to separate those two things really sometimes requires being able to step back, set your own personal feelings aside, and look at what the numbers say. And so I think being able to develop some quantitative data based upon what's actually happening will be very useful to see, number one, if our concerns are overblown, or number two, to what extent this is really creating damage within the community and within our economy. And based upon that, then I think the legislature will hopefully be able to shape some legislation that addresses it. Again, sometimes information is power, and my hope is that will be the case here. I certainly, as any scientist should be, certainly acknowledge the fact that I could be wrong about this. But what I'd like to see is some data. But my gut tells me that this is a serious problem that hopefully in the long run, the legislature will be doing something more substantive about.
On the other side of that coin, something that's a lot more lucrative and a positive potentially for the state of Michigan is the future of the automotive industry in the electric vehicle space. The federal government recently decided on which certain electrical vehicles will be eligible for tax credits. There's a couple of big winners in the electric vehicle space coming out of that determination. Who are those winners?
Yeah, and this is actually kind of an interesting story because I've been watching the news and comparing how it's been covered at the local level, at the national level, and at the international level. And it's funny to see the differences that there are, because a lot of the coverage that you see from outside of Michigan has focused on the fact that you're talking only a very small number of vehicles that are going to be covered by this, and we're talking about, of course, the tax credits that
Right.
essentially makes it cheaper for people to buy electric vehicles. And this goes back to the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed about a year ago. And that legislation, which is named for inflation reduction, but really is a climate bill, to be honest, provided the up to $7,500 tax credit to encourage people to buy electric vehicles. And the sense was that this would be something that would really kind of help us shift into more of an electric vehicle economy by making them more affordable for people. Because part of the problem, of course, is when you're dealing with early technology, it ends up, excuse me, it ends up being more expensive than the technology you already had in place. So by offering these tax credits, we're able to start an industry going around EVs, and we're able to start to generate those economies of scale, which we all heard about in Econ 101, that will finally start to bring down the price in these electric vehicles. So the sense was that, oh, that's what will happen. But part of the compromise that the Inflation Reduction Act represented was that it required that much of the assembly of these vehicles, as well as the development of the batteries and the materials that went into the batteries, had to either come from the United States or from countries with which we have a free trade agreement. So it kind of excluded a lot of countries that, frankly, have been more predatory on a trade basis with the United States. So, looking at it from the perspective of the local coverage has been much more favorable because, of course, one of the big winners from this has been General Motors, our local company here, and probably the second biggest winner, aside from Tesla, which, of course, we know has been huge in the electric vehicle industry, is Ford. General Motors, in particular, they've got the Bolt, which a lot of people have been talking about very excitedly because of the fact that it is really one of the first, I think, mass market electric vehicles that you can see out there. Its price is lower than what you see on anything from Tesla, anything from Ford, really anything from any other company, and yet they're offering still a very good vehicle. In fact, Consumer Reports gives the Chevy Bolt, for example, a very, very good reviews. And you see great reviews about it all through the news media. Now, granted, they had some problems early on, but it appears that they've pretty much resolved those. So, as a result of the fact that GM has really made such a big commitment in the electric vehicle space, both the Bolt, I'm sorry, I keep getting those two mixed up. The Bolt and some of the newer electric vehicles that it has coming out, like the Blazer, for example, and the Silverado, are all going to qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit. And in fact, GM, I believe, is the company with the most models that are going to be qualifying for it. Interestingly enough, there are no foreign manufacturers at this point that qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit. And just as a side, one thing that is interesting also is that in addition to Ford qualifying with a number of vehicles, although not the Mustang Mach E that so many people have been talking about, because its battery is manufactured overseas, but in fact, actually, Chrysler has a couple of vehicles that qualify, even though they don't make any fully electric vehicles. And that has to do with the fact that certain vehicles, if they're plug in hybrid vehicles and their batteries large enough, they can also qualify for the credit. So I think actually the Pacifica qualifies for the credit, as well as some other vehicles. So the big headline that you've seen in all the coverage has been the fact that the American automakers are the big winners in this. And really, the top winner in this, good news for us here in Michigan, is our hometown company, General Motors. So I think we all should be feeling very good about that right now.
Yeah, that's good news as we move forward in the automotive industry here in Michigan, and especially in the Detroit area. And there seems to continue to be that greater push from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, not just for the future, but also for very soon from now, the next couple of years, next few years, really trying to push that forward as electric vehicles being the primary source of these new vehicles out on the roads. Michael, thank you as always for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Tyler. Have a great weekend.